Prester John was a legendary Christian patriarch, presbyter, and king. Stories popular in Europe in the 12th to the 17th centuries told of a Church of the East patriarch and king who was said to rule over a Christian nation lost amid the pagans and Muslims in the Orient. The accounts were often embellished with various tropes of medieval popular fantasy, depicting Prester John as a descendant of the three magi, ruling a kingdom full of riches, marvels, and strange creatures. At first, Prester John was imagined to reside in India. Tales of Church of the East Christians' evangelistic success there, and of Thomas the Apostle's subcontinental travels, as documented in works like the Acts of Thomas, probably provided the first seeds of the legend. After the coming of the Mongols to the Western world, accounts placed the king in Central Asia, and eventually Portuguese explorers came to believe that the term was a reference to Ethiopia, by which time it had been an isolated Christian exclave, distant from any other Christian-ruled territory. Though its immediate genesis is unclear, officially the origin of the legend of Prester John originates from a letter that the Byzantine Emperor Manuel I Komnenos received in 1165. The sender was John, Christian sovereign and Lord of Lords. The letter described the very rich lands of this monarch located in Central Asia. The king said he lived in an immense palace made of gems and gold, and said he governed a huge territory extending from Persia to China. For many years, the myth of Prester John was associated with the dream of reaching a sumptuous kingdom, where all material pleasures were fulfilled and people lived in opulence. The legend of Prester John drew strongly from earlier accounts of the Orient and of Westerners' travels there. Particularly influential were the stories of St. Thomas the Apostle's proselytizing in India, recorded especially in the 3rd century work known as the Acts of Thomas. This text inculcated in Westerners an image of India as a place of exotic wonders and offered the earliest description of St. Thomas establishing a Christian sect there, motifs that loomed large over later accounts of Prester John. Similarly, distorted reports of movements in Asia of the Church of the East, Nestorianism, informed the legend as well. This church had gained a wide following in the Eastern nations and engaged the Western imagination as an assemblage both exotic and familiarly Christian. Particularly inspiring were the Church of the East's missionary successes among the Mongols and Turks of Central Asia. French historian René Grousset suggests that the Prester John story may have had its origins in the Carrot clan, which had thousands of its members join the Church of the East shortly after the year 1000. By the 12th century, the Karaite rulers were still following a custom of bearing Christian names, which may have fueled the legend. The Alexander Romance, a fabulous account of Alexander the Great's conquests, was especially influential in this regard. The Prester John legend as such began in the early 12th century with reports of visits of an Archbishop of India to Constantinople and of a Patriarch of India to Rome at the time of Pope Calixtus II. These visits, apparently from the St. Thomas Christians of India, cannot be confirmed, evidence of both being second-hand reports. What is certain is that German chronicler Otto of Freising reported in his Chronicon of 1145 that the previous year he had met Hugh, Bishop of Jabala in Syria, at the court of Pope Eugene III in Viterbo. Additionally, the tradition may have drawn from the shadowy early Christian figure John the Presbyter of Syria, whose existence is first inferred by the ecclesiastical historian and Bishop Eusebius of Caesarea, based on his reading of earlier church fathers. The title Prester is an adaptation of the Greek word presbyteros, literally meaning elder, and used as a title of priests holding a high office. Indeed, presbyter is the origin of the English word priest. This man, said in one document to be the author of 2 of the epistles of John, was supposed to have been the teacher of the martyr bishop Papias, who had in turn taught Irenaeus. However, little links this figure, supposedly active in the late 1st century, to the Prester John legend beyond the name. Later accounts of Prester John borrowed heavily from literary texts concerning the East, including the great body of ancient and medieval geographical and travel literature. Details were often lifted from literary and pseudo-historical accounts, such as the tale of Sinbad the Sailor. Prester John had been considered the ruler of India since the legend's beginnings, but India was a vague concept to the medieval Europeans. Writers often spoke of the three Indias, and lacking any real knowledge of the Indian Ocean, they sometimes considered Ethiopia one of the three. Westerners knew that Ethiopia was a powerful Christian nation, but contact had been sporadic since the rise of Islam. No Prester John was to be found in Asia, so Europeans began to suggest that the legend was a reference to the Christian kingdom of Ethiopia. Evidence has suggested that locating Prester John's kingdom in Ethiopia entered the collective consciousness around 1250. Marco Polo had discussed Ethiopia as a magnificent Christian land, and Orthodox Christians had a legend that the nation would one day rise up and invade Arabia, but they did not place Prester John there. Then, in 1306, 30 Ethiopian ambassadors from Emperor Wedem Arad came to Europe, and Prester John was mentioned as the patriarch of their church in a record of their visit. Czech Franciscan Remedius Prudký asked Emperor Iyasu II about this identification in 1751, and Prudký states that the man was astonished and told me that the kings of Abyssinia had never been accustomed to call themselves by this name. In a footnote to this passage, Richard Pankhurst states that this is apparently the first recorded statement by an Ethiopian monarch about this tale, and they were likely unaware of the title until Prudky's inquiry. 17th century academics like German Orientalist Hiob Ludolf demonstrated that there was no actual native connection between Prester John and the Ethiopian monarchs, and search for the fabled king gradually ceased. But the legend had affected several hundred years of European and world history, directly and indirectly, by encouraging Europe's explorers, missionaries, scholars, and treasure hunters. The prospect of finding Prester John had long since vanished, but the tales continued to inspire through the 20th century. William Shakespeare's 1600 play, Much Ado About Nothing, contains an early modern reference to the legendary king, as does Tirso de Molina's El Burlador de Sevilla. In 1910, Scottish novelist and politician John Buchan used the legend in his sixth book, Prester John, to supplement a plot about a Zulu uprising in South Africa. This book is an archetypal example of the early 20th century adventure novel and proved very popular in its day. Throughout the rest of the century, Prester John appeared sporadically in pulp fiction and comics. For example, Marvel Comics has featured Prester John in issues of Fantastic Four and Thor. He was a significant supporting character in several issues of the DC Comics fantasy series, Arak, Son of Thunder. Charles Williams, a member of the 20th century literary group The Inklings, made Prester John a messianic protector of the Holy Grail in his 1930 novel, War in Heaven.